My name is Silvia Massini. I'm a professor of economics and management of innovation here, member of the organizing committee, and I feel very, very honored and pleased to chair this final plenary session of this 7th GeoInno conference. Davide is a senior research fellow at INGENIO at the University of Valencia. Davide studied here for his postgraduate program. He was not only a PhD student, but also a researcher at what was then the Institute, what was CRIC, and then it became MIOR. Davide has done extensive research on medical innovation, service innovation, medical innovation, and then keeps knowledge-intensive business services. And more recently, well, he started back when he was a research fellow, when he started to study skills, and this theme has continued throughout his projects, and from skills to employment and jobs. He's going to talk to us about green jobs this afternoon. He has been involved in a number of research projects. He's editor of several innovation journals. So we are looking forward to hearing about his presentation on everything on green, or is it?
Thank you. Thank you, Silvia. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Well, welcome. Thanks a lot for being here. It's a great pleasure. And thanks, Silvia, for the great presentation and introduction. Before I start, I would like to say two things. One is congratulations to Elvira Mabel for the fantastic organizations. You managed to drag 400 eager scholars in Manchester in January, of all times. And you've done it very well, so thank you. And of course, some of you may know Manchester was my alma mater, so it feels like coming home, so it feels all the more special. And again, I want to thank them for giving me this opportunity to be here. I'm going to talk about, well, the presentation is structured in two bits. The first is looking backwards, and I'm going to talk about an agenda that's been emerging for the past 10, 15 years. I've been lucky enough to be part of this agenda together with others on green jobs, green tasks, and green employment. Occasionally these terms are used in a kind of interchangeable way, and I'm going to make a case that that's actually, of course, not the case. And so I'm going to look backward, and in the second part of the presentations, once I've taken stock of research on these topics, I'm going to look forward. And so the last bit is going to be, it depends how you look at it. Maybe it's going to be a propositive look ahead for a future agenda. It's going to be a rant about things that I haven't done yet, depending on whatever you want to see. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge from this moment that I'm here talking about these things, but it wouldn't have been possible without the great teamwork of friends and co-authors that have been working together with me. Some of them are here. And, of course, any errors or omissions, ask them. So, as Silvia already anticipated, the seeds of this research is actually in Manchester, in a kind of a dodgy place. I don't know if you've had the opportunity, but it's aptly called Thirsty Scholar. I don't know about the scholars, but Thirsty is definitely their forte. This is when Francesco Vaughan and I coincided here in Manchester. Francesco Vaughan is a longtime friend and economist, who was here at the beginning of his postdoc fellowship. He came from labor economics with an interest in innovation. My background was in innovation with an interest on pretty much anything else. And of course, we started talking, and one of the things that we recognized at that point was that there was a bit of a gap in the agenda of innovation studies about employment skills. Some works had been published, but we thought it was really underdeveloped. And young and ambitious as we were, we started thinking about what would be the next big thing, what would be the next topic for us to try to venture and try to develop this agenda. And green jobs actually the green revolution, I'm not sure it was called that way back then, but anyway, anything that had to do with the greener world was still on the horizon in innovation studies. There were definitely there were not conference sessions about that. There were no special issues. So it was a green field. I use the term here futuristic topic because our understanding at the time was that the only work that was available was primarily policy reports. And the green transition was perceived to be something really remote in the future. And there was a lot of bias towards green technologies. And of course, the emphasis of green technologies means that when they talk about skills and jobs, they used to associated them with technical kind of jobs. So that's why it's interesting for us to see that this picture, which is taken from one of those very early reports, I think represents the state of the debate. There was a lot of emphasis. The ICT transition, which was the last big transition that had happened at that point, was the kind of narrative of reference. Of course, fast forward 15, 17 years, we know that there's a lot more to this story. And I'm happy to see that in more recent times, the debate has changed, the narrative has changed, so as to be also more sensitive towards things about inclusiveness, about decency and quality of jobs, and of course about inequality or equality of opportunity. So the first thing that we started to do, Francesca and I, at the very beginning was we started asking, what are green jobs? The thing that we found was that, as you all know in this kind of conferences, you're slave to the dates you have, really, to the data you have. The national statistical offices back then used to collect data on green employment, green jobs, and they use this sectoral approach, whereby if a sector produces a green good or a service, automatically the employment, the full workforce of that sector would be considered representative of the green jobs and green employment, which we found a bit weird, first of all, because it's a sectoral approach. So it's good if you're interested in those sectors. It's great, of course. But we wanted to understand the shifts in employment. And the shifts in employment, not just quantitative changes in demand and supply, but also the qualitative transformation of the knowledge base that underpins those occupations as a response or as a trigger to changes in not just technology, but just the way we do things in a more environmentally friendly way. So we started thinking, and we found inspiration in two things. One is qualitative work by Anne Marcussen. Most of you will probably know her. She has a string of papers which did the qualitative work on the analysis of employment structure in the United States. She came up with this very compact but fantastic motto: focus on what jobs do rather than what they make. So think of the skills of the skill set as not just functional to production activity, but all the possible ways in which this know-how can be employed towards jobs. And then, of course, the other thing was the big point of reference was the literature on labor economics, which was then nascent. I know it's 2007, but there was no Twitter. Things were slower back then. But in 2003 and 2004, Otto Levy-Mernen had published a seminar paper on what we know now as the task approach. So we thought that was an interesting way to bring this kind of debate more closer to innovation studies. Now, again, we are very much limited in our aspirations hit an upper bound when the reality of data become concrete. But we were lucky enough because in the United States, the National Statistical Office had been collecting for years a repository information. Anybody who works on skills and labor will know ONET and his predecessor, DOT, which is basically a repository of occupation-specific information. So these are not employment data. This is a repository of qualitative and partly quantitative information about 900 occupational titles, which, luckily for us, at some point, I think after 2004, started collecting data on green activities, green tasks involved in jobs. So our intuition was relatively simple, and it stayed simple, luckily. If it can help you, you can think of the data are organized, think of an occupation as a vector of characteristics, these being the characteristic, for example, work tasks, Some will be green, some will be not green. So using this intuition, we calculated this index, which is again extremely simple. It's a weighted average of green and non-green tasks within each occupation. That we call greenness. The great thing about greenness is that it's a continuous measure to proxy the degree of penetration of green tasks within one occupation or within the whole workforce, of course, if you scale it up. So, of course, if you take greenness equal to 1, so 100% of work tasks, you find the usual suspects, environmental technicians, recycling coordinators. These are the green jobs that you will find anywhere, pretty much anywhere in the existing literature. But if you start looking at lower levels of greenness, so greenness that is less than 1, you actually find occupations much more familiar and maybe surprising. Few people think of compliance managers or transportation planners necessarily as green jobs. Certainly they did not back in the day. So once we start unveiling this, we find out that these are all macro occupation categories in the United States. Again, not employment data. This is just counting categories of occupations. This is the breakdown between brown and green occupations. As you can see, there's management jobs, legal. These are high skill, medium, and low skill. And as you can see, this is the binary view. This is the outlook of how occupation would look like if you were thinking about green versus non-green. But if you consider our method, greenness uncovers a lot more variety. And happily for us, and interestingly for us, it's not concentrated only in the upper echelons. It's actually also present in middle and also low skill occupations, which was surprising for us. So that was, sorry, this is an attempt to do something psychedelic, but you get the idea. So this is the point where we started asking ourselves, does it really make sense to think of green jobs? Are we really looking at green jobs, or are we looking at greening of occupations, at the whole workforce? Some occupations will be more green, others will be less, others will not be. And maybe we could rethink the whole process, the whole agenda in a different, take the agenda in a different perspective. So this is this part of the presentation. I'm going to showcase some results building on that foundation, which I wouldn't call conceptual, because I don't think it's that conceptual, but it's our building block. And this is also going to be maybe the geekiest part of the presentation. So if you're not into it, it's a good time to do your online check-in if you're in a hurry. So using greenness, this time applied to employment data, we can actually measure what we call green employment, which again is simply the share of penetration, the degree of penetration of green tasks in the workforce. This is in the United States. So we did this for various areas, all areas in the whole territory in the United States, metro, no metro. We focused, these studies focus on the periods 2016 and 6 to 14. There is also a reason, there's a reason about how they changed the way in which they classify areas, and by then we had written the paper, so we never developed, but this is just to give you an idea. So what are the main results? This is all published work. So by our measure, green employment amounted to about 3.5%, which is anyway of employment share, which is higher than you would get from the sector-based approach. It's strongly pro-cyclical. We were lucky enough there was a big recession right in the middle of our data set, which was helpful for us, though, to check something which I'll talk about in a minute. Green occupations are widely represented across the whole skill set. And again, this contradicts the early report where we started. Our starting point was that everybody was expecting green jobs to be high-skill technical occupations, and this is not the case here. We found that green jobs tend to be more geographically concentrated than non-green jobs, comparable non-green jobs, and that there is a positive association between unrelated variety, those of you who work on these things, and the growth of green employment in metro areas. This is restricted to metro areas. So in this paper, which I think is maybe the most complete, we actually took a step further and we asked ourselves, what are the sources, what are the drivers, and what are the effects of green employment? So, again, I'm going to go fast here because this is all published work. I don't really want to showcase too much, but we find that the characteristics, this is the not very surprising bit of the story, but the main drivers of growth of green employment tends to be that geographical areas are wealthier, they are more technologically proactive as measured by patent intensity, and also they are more resilient to shocks. This is where the financial recession, if it was useful for something, at least it was useful for our paper. But also the somewhat surprising result for us was that when we looked at the role of policy, we found that there is a much stronger effect and positive effect, so it's a driver of growth of green employment when we consider public procurement, the RRI, that's the Obama package essentially spending, was much more effective than command and control interventions, which are basically regulations, so thresholds to emissions. This is interesting in view also of the Green Deal, of the design of the Green Deal. Huge parts of the Green Deal are about command and control interventions, which of course are important, but we should take into account that sometimes they may not drive the growth of green employment as much as one wishes. Then we looked at the effects of green employment, and here we report two things. One is we asked ourselves whether the growth of green employment has positive effects on local economies using the Moretti multiplier. To our surprise, we found a multiplier which is between 4.2 and 5.1 non-tradable jobs on local economy. This is pretty large compared to, for example, I think the Moretti story was about 6. This is for high-tech manufacturing. We actually exchanged emails with him because we were a bit puzzled, and he gave us his blessing, so that was good enough for us. But the point is that we seem to have there's a positive effect, which is sort of positive spillover effect. And then we also found that green employment is associated to, there's a wage premium for green employment, which amounts to about 4% if you consider on average, and it's much higher, of course, for high-skill occupations. We never really went much further than this, but I think one of the interesting or instinct questions would be whether green jobs are associated to inequality to some extent. So this is one of the things we haven't done, and I think we could have, that could be developed. So just to sum up, this is pretty much what we have done on the basis of it, and related to this, many other scholars and also policy think tanks have been working in parallel with this. So if you work on this topic, consider yourself cited and acknowledged. I think the point is that there has been a lot of work on trying to quantify green jobs, and this is where I turn to the second part of my presentation. And at this point, and in view of preparing this presentation, I started asking myself whether that kind of question still makes sense now. It's definitely a very interesting topic, if I say so myself, but there are some issues. Some are technical, and some I think have to do more with the surrounding circumstances. So let me break them down. First of all, the main result of our especially early research is that we don't talk about green jobs. We talk about greening of employment, which implies a change in perspective in how you think about this, because you're not longer thinking of an elite set of occupations which will emerge in the economy and will save the world, but rather you're thinking about a lot of structural change which are, as we all know, slow, imperfect, and of course not necessarily homogeneous. One of the questions, and I know I can speak for at least another of my co-authors, Francesco Vona, about this, is that we get asked very often the question, can we do the same thing for European countries? And the answer, sadly, is for whole European countries, I don't think so. Sorry to break it to you. I've tried many things. Many people, better, more trained people that on data analysis have tried. There are many difficulties. We can get in the details if you're interested on the QA, but it's essentially the problem of you need granular data. You need very granular employment data to do that kind of exercise. If you start working with things like the EU Labour Force Survey, which tends to conflate and have very aggregate occupational dimensions, you really lose the essence of the importance of identifying exactly which occupations have a higher greenness or not. And that, I think, dilutes also the usefulness of this kind of exercise. My own take, I take blame for this, and I'm not speaking for any of my co-authors, but I know that sometimes people use ONET for other countries other than the United States. Personally, I don't think it's a good idea, because some of those tables, conversion tables, are very funny, and well, the institutional setup in the United States is very, very different. So to say that a manager in the United States is comparable to a manager in, say, Spain or any other continental European country, I think it's a big leap in terms of autonomy of the job, in terms of responsibility, insurance, and so on and so forth. So I'm always very, very careful. But of course, I'm not dissing anybody who tries to do this. It's just this is my own concern. And the other point is that, though, I have a bit more of trust on country-specific data, because some countries have actually excellent data sets, and I'm actually involved in some of these efforts. So maybe there needs to be an effort starting from the ground. But I think then there is an implicit question here, and if you happen to have an email address, maybe you can drop them a line. Eurostat has been praising ONET for more than 20 years, saying that that's a fantastic database, it's a great source of information, and yet the information available for European jobs at European level is still, I don't think it's up to the levels of ONET. And so one wonders why, what would it take to change the way in which they collect data and start doing something which is similar, and then they themselves praise. There is the avenue of ESCO, but there are many problems. Again, I'm very conscious of time, so I don't want to get too much into the detail here. But the point is, you need very granular data to do that kind of work for European economies. But then there are more fundamental questions. Quantifying green employment is, of course, one part of the story. But if you look at this kind of question from the reality of today, we are about to, well, the Green Deal is already happening around us. So does it really make sense to try to paint the pretty picture of which countries and regions are more green when the EU Green Deal is actually going to have a huge effect on brown jobs? So maybe we should ask ourselves which regions are more exposed to the EU Green Deal, of which part of Green Deal, which regions and class of workers and sectors are more at risk. Are training and education systems prepared for these avalanche of changes, which are about to happen? They are about to be implemented. And most importantly, this is a big concern, are social welfare systems prepared? I'm sure that geographers would agree immediately that not all countries and systems are, let's say that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the ability of institutions to adapt. If you think of the scale of changes, and scale of retraining, and the scale of social welfare response that you need in front of the EU Green Deal, I think that these kind of questions, so focusing actually on the brown part of the EU economies, may be more interesting because of the reality in which we live now. And if you want to push the boundary one step further, even if we talk about green jobs, are we sure that green jobs are good jobs, are decent jobs? Are green jobs associated to increases in inequality or not? If you buy the story that there is a life cycle, so at the beginning of some of transitions, socio-technical transitions, let's use this term loosely, so I apologize for those who are experts, but if you are at the beginning of that, we know that there is going to be a rush of demand in some skills which are probably scarce at the beginning, which drives inequality. We know that's happened many times in history. So are green jobs just and decent? These are things that the International Labour Organization and many policy reports ask, but I think that the scholarly community still hasn't started delving into these things. And I think that would be very interesting. So another avenue which I think would be worth investigating. And then what's more important is whether the green transition is gender biased, and which direction does the bias lie. Now, there are two ways, again, to look at this. The traditional approach would have been, since green jobs, as they have been, and still are, understood, they tend to be technical, knowing the underrepresentation of women in STEM education and jobs, we expect this to be a source of inequality, of gender inequality. But I would put the question in more positive terms. What is the role of women in the green transition? Do women have some cognitive advantage relative to men, and how can that be explored and analyzed in order for, let's say, make the most of the human capital we have, to put it very, very bluntly. Again, this goes in the direction of some of the things that already have been discussed. I'm aware that people are working on the team diversity, for example, of inventors, but there's many other dimensions, I think, of interest which would be worthwhile pursuing. And then the last point that I'm going to make is the remote scenario of climate change, which is something that will happen, and we will deal with it because we'll have all the technology and all the skills ready. When it comes, we'll be ready. Unfortunately, it's no longer the case because I think there's a social acceptance now in the media, in the policy, and of course among many scientists that actually climate change is happening here. So rather than thinking of green jobs or greening of jobs, shouldn't we be thinking about what does it mean to work and be employed in a greening economy, where the greening economy are economies that are exposed to climate change, that have to deal with climate change, not prepare for it, but deal with it. So there are issues, and two issues come to mind. One is the transition relies a lot on critical materials, which are, as we know, not only sometimes rare materials, but also processing and scaling up represent very, very important, huge challenges. Europe in particular is not in the best position because not only it needs a lot of material, but it doesn't produce very many. So every time a policymaker makes a plea in terms of an X% of cars next year, new cars will be, or by the end of the decade will be greener, I think of the analogy of famous butterfly and the hurricane, and I think that some people are going to suffer in Chile or other countries where these materials are extracted. So this is a case where should I shut up now? That's subtle. All right. This works. Okay. So if we are confronting this situation, these things call upon analysis which deals with quality of work, quality of job, and even human rights. And even if it's not the fancy version of green jobs analysis, it still has to do with jobs that are transforming and adapting fast to the reality of climate change. And last but not least, there are many areas that suffer of climate change vulnerability. Occupations such as firemen or coast guards are going to confront a different scenario. They are going to have to adapt, going to undergo training because they are going to have to confront growing challenges from climate change. So again, this doesn't fall neatly into the glossy category of understanding of green jobs, but again, it fits very well the reality of having to work and having to adapt to the reality of climate change. I'm happy to see that in this conference, many papers are already touching upon some of these topics. I'm aware that Rodriguez Pose and also Bontadini with Francesco Vona are working on the challenges of the EU Green Deal. I myself am working with this with Eduardo and Dioni. I'm aware that there are papers on critical materials, so there's a critical mass, hopefully, that will start delving with these issues. And so I'm not completely negative and pessimistic, in spite of what those who know me may think. But I think that, so just to conclude, looking backwards, we tried to do the best that we could with the data we had. And I think that not only us, of course, but that the scholarly community and the policy community has certainly made a lot of progress in terms of understanding the nature of green jobs. So once you understand the nature of green jobs, then comes the question, does it really make sense to just focus on that, or shouldn't we be thinking of a bigger agenda? Now, for this bigger agenda to happen, we need young, talented, and eager, and hungry researchers, not hungry researchers to pursue that line of research, and of course, hopefully, a little bit of understanding also from editorial offices and referee too. I know you're there somewhere, and trying to think that sometimes we need new data, new types of data to address new questions, And so a little bit of diversity, which I know is a staple of this community. I'll finish here. I'll leave the word to Erika. Thanks very much.